and the Economic Recovery and Resiliency Council that WNDD has put together as a part of our CARES Act funding. The Economic Recovery Council is made up of more than 130 unique organizations and members that are led by council reps in 13 economic categories. These multidisciplinary teams of subject matter experts are working collaboratively and in partnership to determine and develop a coordinated and seamless plan that will support the region's economic recovery and resiliency from future economic disruptions. All of these efforts will align with the Nevada State Plan for Recovery and Resiliency Roadmap on the economic future beyond the pandemic. Part of WNDD's role is to make this an action plan by leveraging it with federal grants and funding that can help us build on our programs, including infrastructure and resources needed to not only address the recovery, but also resiliency. We hope that today's webinar will inform not only our recovery and resiliency plan that we're in the midst of creating, but also aspects of your organization and business as we navigate this new normal. If you want to find more about our work, please visit our website at WNDD.org. So with that, again, I'm going to ask you all to stop your videos and mute yourselves. And please, again, when you have questions, you'll just present them in the chat room. So our first presenter, and I'm just looking for her, is there you are, is Jillian Donato. Thank you for joining us. Jillian Donato is lead staffer in administering programs in support of members of the Houston Galveston Area Council and Gulf Coast Economic Development District. She's leading design and execution of a 2-year action plan for COVID-19 related economic recovery and support for other programs across the sustainable development portfolio ranging from regional conservation to transportation. We were most interested in including the Houston Galveston region as they did write an economic recovery and resiliency plan as a result of Hurricane Harvey in 2017. And Jillian has kindly and graciously going to present the impacts of that a particular event. And I think she'll also be sharing what occurred with their most recent event, the freeze over of Texas. So Jillian, thank you.
Thank you. Good morning. As Cheryl mentioned, I am a senior planner and economic recovery coordinator with the Houston Galveston Area Council. For the time of my presentation, I'm going to stop my video to preserve bandwidth as the connection can be a little spotty out here, but I'll join back again when it's time for Q&A. So I'm here to share with you a profile in resiliency planning and through an experience of a particular storm, which is Hurricane Harvey. And before we jump in, I'd like to share a little bit about the economic and organizational and governmental makeup of our region. We're home to 7 million people and a little over 3 million jobs. We have 135 businesses, big and small, home to 23 major global headquarters. We have a 13 county council of governments for which I work for at the Houston Galveston Area Council, within which we have an 8-county metropolitan planning organization. I am the senior administrator for the Economic Development District, which operates at the 13 county level. And if any of you all know the Texas government landscape very well, we have a very segmented local government system. So I oversee and coordinate and support projects across over 34 economic development corporations. I collaborate with over 37 chambers of commerce. We have over 50 different types of special districts with different levels of funding authority. And we have over 31 institutions of higher learning who we work with very closely for our resiliency planning and research and understanding of where to target our efforts. Houston, as many of you know, is home to some very large ports infrastructure for getting large amounts of petrochemical products to global markets. As I said, we're a global headquarters destination. We also have a burgeoning life sciences field with the Texas Medical Center and dozens of regional hospitals. We have abundant land, and it's partly what keeps cost of living very low. So we attract many young and old to come join and live in our thriving city. We're one of the fastest growing metropolises of our size, currently the 4th largest city, and typically at the top of the list for annual growth rates as well. But with these blessings and assets comes some challenges. Attachment to a commodities base as we have leads to a lot of boom and bust cycles. We, like many regions, struggle with equitable outcomes across all segments of our society, and keeping our workforce educated and appropriately informed to keep them competitive for the future workforce. And tied to some of the topics we'll discuss today, because we're not very into things like zoning or firm development code influence, we have to navigate a lot of trade-offs that come with the kind of expansion and growth that we're dealing with. And some of that we learned the hard way through Harvey and our repeating historic flooding events. So we're going to talk about Harvey today, which was notable because it doubled our cumulative flood loss for the previous 40 years combined. But it was also on the heels of 2 other what they would call 100-year storm events during the Memorial Day and Tax Day floods, which were not hurricane related. They were more rain event related from just other weather and climate related shifts. And, you know, Harvey was, at the time, at first we thought, oh, 100-year event. Then, it, you know, we hear on the news 500-year, but turns out it was more like a 1,000-year storm. So it was not just another storm in terms of rainfall, as this chart conveys in terms of what we can measure in insured flood loss. It was far and away our biggest event, but it also showed us things that you can't measure, and we had to learn a lot about what impacts were made and why it was due to some very unique traits of the storm that we had not seen or anticipated. Just to place myself in the context relative to the storm, I actually was there. I was not working for HGAC at the time, but I was located in an urban context. So I was, you know, anxiously devouring the news via Twitter and radio any way that I could. And the building that I was in actually didn't flood, but the sustained rain was so much for the drainage on site that it damaged the building to the point where it was condemned and we had to vacate. So I became not necessarily displaced. I wouldn't classify myself. I didn't end up in a shelter, but I did have to move in the middle of it. And so there was a lot of gutting of facilities that took place. I donated to a lot of those groups, but had to move my family at the time. And then I was not there for the immediate rebuild, but I was part of a team of researchers in the post hoc world looking back at the storm over a year or 2 later with the Commission to Rebuild Texas and some academic researchers that were then trying to implement some changes to how we understand levels of risk on the ground as it relates to the built environment. And now I'm in the position to implement some regional flood mitigation projects. So what happened during the storm that made it also unique was that it was kind of an unpredictable path. Harvey was born as a tropical wave of low pressure, which swept off the coast of West Africa and made its way through the East Caribbean. And as it moved west, the winds and pressure changed and fluctuated, and the storm strengthened a bit, weakened a bit, and then as soon as it hit the water of Mexico, it became extremely strong in a very short amount of time. Fortunately, as the size of the storm front grew, the governor implemented the State Emergency Management Council, which had been established a few years prior, and brought together a group of agencies to prepare for response, not knowing what part of the coastline it would hit. But so they were arranging for the emergency response period very early. That being said, there wasn't an evacuation planned because it wasn't until about a day or so before the storm hit that we realized just how bad it would be. So there were more stay-at-home orders than evacuation orders just immediately before the storm. So by 10 a.m. on August 25th, it had reached the Category 4 storm and the wind was up to 145 miles an hour. That being said, the storm was moving forward very slowly. And so it became a concentrated rain event more so than a strong, powerful hit as we had experienced with Hurricane Ike. So what was notable about it was not just the rapid creation of a giant storm, but that it was slow moving. And beyond that, you could see from the chart on the right, it actually did sort of a double dip. It came out, or it came in, then back out, and then looped back in again. Some of the things that also made Harvey unique were the types of damage that occurred. And that while many of these different types of storm-related damage had taken place in previous storms, we had not seen the kind of combination of flooding and wind events. So there were high winds and a corresponding 6 to 10 foot storm surge when it made land on the small port town of Rockport, which is really more of a small tourist community. But there were more than 50 tornadoes that were reported over the course of the night, 6 of which were considered an EF1 category that were taking place across the entire 41 counties of the impact zone. There were almost 65 inches of rain that fell, which equates to 19 trillion gallons of water. There were 3 different types of flooding that we experienced. There was urban flooding caused by the amount of rain simply exceeding our capacity of our built infrastructure to drain out into the bays and estuaries and channel systems. Riverine flooding, which causes when a channel can no longer hold the volume of water and breaches the channel walls. And reservoir flooding, which can cause flooding upstream at or near the reservoir and downstream upon release. And these reservoirs were actually, generally speaking, not designed for flood mitigation. They were designed to hold drinking water and to as a filtration system for the area's wastewater facilities. So they really weren't designed for this type of a flood event, nor were the channeling systems designed for that as well. So when they released some of the reservoirs, it flooded in and around the areas, beyond which there were also homes built in some of the reservoirs that have later been amended, but that was another unplanned risk factor. So the results of which were there were only over 250,000 homes flooded. 80,000 of those homes flooded at least 18 inches, and 23,000 of which flooded at least 5 feet or more, causing a total loss. 300,000 cars were flooded. We had 24 hospitals evacuated. 61 communities lost access to drinking water, sometimes for weeks at a time. 23 ports were closed, and over 781 key roads were impassable. That being said, the response was relatively quick because we had been preparing days in advance. So the immediate emergency response to stabilize the affected areas was quite enormous, both the state response and volunteers. The Texas Department of Emergency Management led what was termed the Task Force 1 of the State Emergency Management Council, and they led the coordination mostly with state and federal agencies to integrate functions and administer emergency response. The response effort rescued over 122,000 people and over 5,000 of their pets. They stood up 621 shelters, and 3 million meals and bottles of water were delivered. 300 different volunteer organizations were mobilized, some by grassroots and some even out of state, which you see here from the Louisiana Cajun Navy, which are really just a volunteer group of boatmen who deliver a lot of aid in other storms as well, not just in Texas, but post-Katrina and other storms like that. So we were all in the streets also checking on each other, feeding one another, bringing pizza to rescue workers, donating, and just all of us chipping in where we could. So there was, despite the destruction and just the trauma of what we had all experienced, there was actually a surprising amount of goodwill if you were there, and this feeling of hope that we could pull ourselves out of this. Task Force 2 of the State Emergency Management Council was led by Texas A&M University's system, which mobilized hundreds of extension agents from the Forestry Service, the Sea Grant, and AgriLife Extension. By December 7th, the situation had stabilized enough, and this group led what was termed the Commission to Rebuild Texas. Their task was to assess damage, support rebuilding, and develop recommendations and strategies to protect from future storms. The response and recovery efforts of both task forces really seemed simple enough, although in the Commission's report, that was released about a year and a half later of the sort of post-mortem hindsight was that command was actually really fragmented and coordination was quite challenging. In some cases, these different groups were working only by voluntary coordination or gubernatorial directive among institutions and organizations that actually had adverse incentives and limited experience working together. In some cases, there were lost or misspent resources due to inefficiencies or duplication of effort. For example, license plate approvals for FEMA trailers had to work in coordination with a couple of new departments like the Texas Driver's License Division, which was still relatively new and didn't exist at the time when the original state emergency management protocols were drafted by the governor, at the time, Governor Rick Perry, in the early 2000s. The total estimated damage, combining all measured and estimated damage from the storm, totaled $125 billion across 41 counties. There were $8 billion of flood insurance claims, 4.5 billion small business assistance loans were issued to damaged businesses, $1.5 billion for FEMA individual assistance claims, which is one way of estimating the level of damage in uninsured populations and sites. It's one of those proxy measures that we have to use to estimate how bad it was for those who weren't able to receive any insurance claims. And there was over $1 billion from the state's wind-related insurance claims. Again, this is really, the measured data comes from a lot of people who had insurance for one reason or another. And part of what was challenging about this was that there were many people living in, a 500-year floodplain or lived in areas that literally had never flooded before. But because there were such extreme flooding events, it led to areas that were impacted who had almost no infrastructure to deal with a flood. In total, across 477 zip codes, there was an average damage or estimated loss of $30 million. One of the biggest expected outcomes of Harvey was damage to the Houston area because obviously so many people live there and there was so much more infrastructure that was expensive and costly to repair. But these areas also have the greatest capacity to assess and understand the full extent of damage and can sometimes have an easier time fronting the cost to repair and get back to work. But ground zero of the hurricane's landfall was this dark red area of Aransas County in the southwest corner, which at the time had a population of about 25,000. And of all impacted areas, it has among the lowest rebuilding capacity. Nearly 80% of the homes there were damaged. This was the story in many communities, including those in and around the Beaumont area of the upper right quadrant, which by the time they had actually reached the brunt of the storm damage, they had still been getting rained on for the previous 5 days. So they suffered some very long and sustained damage to some of their really critical facilities. Among the more indirect losses, or losses that are really hard to quantify or are uninsured, or are the result of the aftermath of the storm and may not be eligible for recovery and resilience funding, are related to environmental, economic, and social outcomes. There were numerous hazardous spills and chemical fires caused by flooding. Superfund sites with sensitive casings were inundated for days, and wildlife habitats that in other instances served to protect our coast from subsidence and storms were critically damaged, and we're now in the process of rebuilding those. Our oyster populations are really important protectors of our coastlines, and we had almost entirely total mortality of some of our oyster populations. Economically speaking, just business downtime from businesses not being able to be open was cost estimated at about $2.5 billion. And some of the most heavily inundated areas in the outer surrounding communities outside of Harris County, such as Aransas County, a year later, 15% of the businesses still had not been able to open again. We lost about 55 to 75,000 jobs. Again, noting the flooded cars, these were people who could no longer get to work easily. And in a sprawling metropolis like us, that's a real challenge and was linked to long-term unemployment or dislocation. So gas prices also increased, which made it harder locally for our local populations, although there is a flip side to that, in that when gas prices increase nationally, at least some of our major employers can get up and running. So there are dual sides to a lot of these issues, but again, the downside should be considered from an equity perspective. Socially speaking, over 1 million public school children were affected and couldn't get to school safely or on time for an extended period. Sometimes the impacts of these things take many months to really be shown and evident in school data and for younger populations. So the Commission's report also noted to pay attention to the long-term impact of a traumatic event on our populations, young and old. There were large amounts of federal appropriations. This was just a snapshot from what was passed in 2017, but these were some of the primary federal agencies that worked in coordination with TDEM, or I'm sorry, Texas Department of Emergency Management, and Texas A&M. My agency was involved in facilitating a lot of these types of grants, getting on the ground. However, in the face of $125 billion damage, it does start to feel like, you know, will there be enough to go around? And if it's a year to 2 years after the fact, these really have to be oriented towards long-term resilience, because the rebuild phase has already passed. It's now the time to decide what we may do differently with these funds. And all of this continues in an environment where we're adding approximately 233 square acres of built form to our environment. And the challenge of coordinating effectively with all of the different local governments, the special district typologies, and making sure that we get much better at planning and coordinating our detention, retention, and long-term historic flood damage preparation. So this is noting the change in the built landscape over about a 15-year period. And you can see how much older this is. As we continue to sprawl out, we have to be thinking of the implications on urban flooding, riverine flooding, and all of the channel systems that feed into this. We have dozens of watershed plans that need to be adequately planned for. So as we take from this some key lessons and reorient ourselves toward how do we plan for the future, the Commission's report and some additional hindsight-facing reports from some of the surrounding counties noted that during the time of response, of course, coordinated response is needed, but for long-term flood risk mitigation and management, we really need to adjust our thinking about how insurance does not necessarily protect you from all of the potential impacts of a storm like this. We need to work much more at an intergovernmental and regional and watershed level to really understand and plan for changes. Communications management is a really big one here, and how do we actually work with local governments to get them the information that they need if they can't have a large and robust emergency management system at their fingertips. Prioritizing vulnerable populations will continue in the future, as we've seen, for rebuilding and relocation or managing buyout programs, which is where, you know, the government may reclaim land or sites that are now considered prone to flooding and compensate for this loss to a family or to the owner of the property. And we also need to be protecting vulnerable ecological and natural resources as well. For infrastructure improvements, I mean, there are some things that came up during Hurricane Ike, such as the Coastal Spine Project, which is a large set of dikes to manage the storm surge and to support our inland ports' ability to sort of vacate water and deal with the inland inundation and keeping the storm surge out so that those things don't combine and cause excess rise in and around the coastal areas. So these are not projects that necessarily were damaged. They were ones that we've been planning and thinking about doing for a long time, and they're big ticket items. So there isn't necessarily one giant, easy to navigate funding structure for these bigger projects that may need an intergovernmental effort. Dealing with our construction and land use codes, long-term environmental hazard planning, and really even not just infrastructure, but how do we use our open spaces and natural resources for their flood mitigation benefits as well. And then future proofing from multiple angles, meaning thinking about this in terms of the complex systems at play, multi-directional flood scenarios, and other types of things that relate to the economic viability of a region that is so tied to things that were put at risk. So what does that look like? Well, one of the things that our agency led was, this was actually shortly after Harvey, we had a plan to engage in a resilience discussion using Hurricane Ike as the framework. But when this plan finally reached the point of actually having the discussion, Harvey had happened only a few months prior. So it ended up being really important that people had a fresh flood on their mind, frankly, because a lot of times once things start to feel normal again, people can have the perception in their mind that it wasn't that bad, or that we know how to rebuild and it's okay, especially if they weren't as impacted as others. So we engaged in a broader regional economic resilience plan. And while the primary driver was the impacts from flooding and this idea of keeping water where it belongs, using our channeling systems and all of our flood planning, we also were able to tie into this discourse the role of the built environment and having much stronger land use and transportation planning incorporated through defending great places, and keeping in mind that connectivity and mobility are a really vital part of being economically resilient if you're part of a resident population. Future proofing also incorporates the idea of economic mobility, and that while all of these disasters happen, we are still in a broad global context where, people need to be upskilling and preparing to always be entering a new innovation environment. So the disruptions that can be caused by technology or industry disruption, we can't forget that, continually training and creating an upwardly mobile workforce is an important part of making us resilient to shocks and not just better at responding. And then economic resilience at the transect also ties into the equation, the different water systems across rural, suburban, and urban systems, and that they're important for managing regional projects, such as on the right, one of the things that we lead is watershed level planning that historically was tied to things like clean water and managing different types of imbalances in water systems, and it wasn't so strongly tied to flood mitigation. But now our water and environmental planning is much more integrated into the resilience discussion as it relates to historic flooding. We just completed a regional conservation framework where we got all of our 13 counties engaged on not just planning for conservation for the recreational benefits of open spaces, but how we can think much more cohesively about using our detention facilities for recreation, having connectivity between our detention facilities so that we don't end up with some of the unique challenges related to the reservoir flooding and the damage that was really due to the lack of thinking at a watershed level. This is one of the most recent grants that we worked with that even stretched beyond our COG, and it's the idea of smart monitoring. So earlier in the presentation, I noted high water marks, and those are literally signs with, foot marks up and down them. And, using just visually looking at them, you can note how high water is, and it protects drivers and pedestrians from entering a space. We're focusing much more heavily on real-time live smart monitoring systems up and down whole watersheds so that we can coordinate detention better, either through smart levee releases and reservoir releases, or just through planning and integrating more and larger detention facilities and dredging, just so that we can understand when different types of flood events happen, how they're impacted up and downstream. One of the other things that we've gotten better at is this idea of really planning proactively for the response effort around vulnerable populations, identifying where they are at a very concise level, and really targeting very early outreach to those populations to evacuate them sooner, so that we don't reach out in hindsight and have to do a really dangerous rescue operation. So getting those early warnings and navigating our roads and effectively understanding how much of the rescue and response operation is going to impact our roads, and planning for if one is impacted, how do we leverage other assets and resources. So this was actually drafted during Hurricane Laura. And so this is something that which just recently happened, if that doesn't sound familiar to you all. About a week in advance of that storm's arrival, we had identified, based on this storm's data, where the likely evacuation zones would need to be, and getting warning out to those vulnerable populations so that we can adequately plan for their care and response. We've also, experienced several other types of disasters now. At the time that I made this map, the data was up to date with COVID-19. The freeze that just happened, we don't quite have at least employment level data on that month, but we have experienced, a range of economic related shocks, some industry specific related shocks, Hurricane Harvey and COVID-19. And one thing that we've learned is that our ability from an employment perspective to navigate this seems not as impacted by a hurricane, at least for the broader metropolitan statistics, as a national recession or things that impact oil and gas prices, which again, it complicates this issue because if you looked at this same chart for Aransas County, which was a much poorer county that was impacted much more severely and has less capacity, their unemployment percentage went up to over 10%. So again, those disparate impacts, and understanding that we can't get on our heels and assume that if there may or may not be a rising tide, or if overall we're doing better, that there's nothing to be done. We definitely see and understand that there are broader levels of resilience to consider to different types of shocks. Similarly, from a sales tax perspective, we have things like construction booms, and there is actually tends to be a flood of money into the construction side, and small scale support services tend to boom during hurricane season. So we don't see those dipping as deeply as when there's an energy downturn. Or with COVID, the energy downturn was the result of the entire nation not being mobile and active. So our sales tax locally wasn't as dramatically harmed, but because oil and gas was depressed, that's where our biggest impacts in terms of spending in parts of our labor force went down. And overall, yes, we may see growing populations. We do tend to generate either inward migration or natural increase. Our population does rise, but these major storm events do impact real people. So we have to look below the surface of our economic data points and see the movement of people and how vulnerable they may or may not be. As we see here, we had a plus from Hurricane Katrina when we took on hundreds of thousands of people from that storm. We also lost many during Hurricane Harvey who just could not wait out the rebuild. People like myself who had to make a harder decision about where they were ultimately going to end up. So what have we learned from this combination of shocks? And some of this relates to the freezing, which unfortunately I don't have good meaningful data on the impacts yet because we're still taking stock of that. But I would say that what we've learned through the ecological challenges of flooding and freezing is that regionalism, I just put regionalism as a muscle. It's something that we have had experience doing multiple times for hurricanes. And so when we do have something major like that, we have gotten better at working together and coordinating. Our populations are able to hunker down, although we're used to doing that in the heat and not the cold. And that was a major challenge that, the biggest cause of death of that event was actually hypothermia. And in a place like Southern Texas, that's really not common. We also see that the open space efforts, so using our open spaces as flood mitigation and recreation, was another win when it came to COVID. It reinforced the need for those investments and the resiliency of those types of facilities and assets for our local governments. They realized all these people are now going out to our parks, and the large detention facilities that we've dressed up with trails are being used more than ever. So those are things that worked out well. We've continued to realize that industry-based and concentration is as important to our economic resilience as our response to ecological disasters. The education and digital skills gap is a really important factor for us in becoming a stronger overall economy and our ability to attract new types of businesses and industries and grow them internally. And that these social impacts and this sort of idea of bottom-up development and bottom-up resiliency planning is really the key to our overall regional resilience. And the harder lessons that we're still learning is, these infrastructure investments are expensive, and different types of communities have different levels of resources to deal with them. And even though the impacts of them cross governmental borders, that doesn't mean we have the funding tools to operate that way and to make large, multi-organizational investments. So the political will and support also touches how we handle private sector investment and our willingness to actually engage with the development sphere, enforce, higher levels of flood planning, and to do more than just adapt and get back to normal, but actually adapt to mitigate future damage. And that just sort of crosses the board. One of the other new lessons that I think we're learning, is the importance of broadband and remote work. In our other disasters, we relied heavily on radio networks and even person-to-person and organizational partnerships with local organizations. But now, for these sustained periods where people are at home, the importance of broadband infrastructure is really huge, and it's a new element of the need for a new type of resilient infrastructure. So overall, just wanted to leave you all with thoughts that the way that our region has sort of learned from new types of disasters and repeated ones is an adaptability mindset and a growth mindset. That, the idea of lifelong learning happens at the institutional level as well. That, again, becoming resilient is a matter of building muscles. It's not a set of decisions that are written on paper and done one time. We have to keep evolving. We also have to learn and understand when it is appropriate to let go of silos and these discrete protocols for each type of institution. And we have to think beyond boundaries, beyond our different missions, and work together when the time requires it. And again, that bottom-up approach as the guidepost, that if you plan for the lowest common denominator or the least capable and prepared, you have a much smoother transition. It shortens your recovery period, and it helps get the entire region back on track faster. And with that, I'd be happy to take your questions.
Thank you so much, Jillian. If any of you all have questions now of Jillian, please pose those in the chat room.
Cheryl, I have 3 already.
Okay, so Don, you want to go ahead and start?
Yes, coordination of response activities from Harvey was fragmented. Was the lack of coordination activities improved post-COVID? Did you kind of see the landscape and go, wow, we maybe we're not as fragmented with the COVID response as we are with the Harvey response?
I wouldn't say that that's necessarily been the type of thing that translated. That's where I kind of draw a distinction. Like, there are issues that I think from our ecological events tend to be stronger. Like, I do feel like even post freeze, there's because the utilities infrastructure and the grids cross borders naturally. However, COVID, from my experience so far, has not led to a lot of intergovernmental coordination. It's been much more, people not knowing exactly where to look. So they tend to fall back on, of course, the governor, and then some communities look more towards the CDC. I wouldn't say that there has been, and there's new players here as well, a much stronger presence from public health, as opposed to our the flood infrastructure, the flood control districts, the emergency management tools have not been applied that same way, at least in our state. It's been much more fragmented in that way.
3 to 4 years after the Harvey event, have you been able to implement any of your resiliency plans? And what was the process to go from plan to implementation?
Well, at least as far as our economic resiliency plan, there were key pieces of infrastructure that were identified, but it was not a plan that came with funding. So it was really getting the right groups to agree on certain projects. For instance, there were ones that were ultimately implemented, a really important levee project next to the small town of Wharton. That investment got made. The Harris County just actually released a progress report on their watershed level mitigation investments. They got very aggressive and identified a lot of projects down to the tributary levels and things like that. And I'd say, you know, they're probably proceeding at about 70%. So many of them got implemented, but at least as far as the flood related infrastructure and the mitigation part, I'd say if you're in the more urban areas, you're moving along faster, but some of the surrounding communities definitely not. And some of them are even hoping to still get funding for other types of infrastructure that flooded from Ike and not Harvey. So that still remains to be a big challenge. And I support a lot of those projects ongoing through funding from the EDA, even though there's no disaster related funds anymore that they can tap.
That relates to the next question. Here in Nevada, we're trying to find a way to have better funding for our infrastructure. What are the tools, what are the revenue tools that you are using to fund your infrastructure? Do you have an infrastructure bank or anything along those lines?
You know, we're in the middle of a legislative session, and that's a big one. And in the middle of the legislative session, which in Texas only meets every 2 years, we had the big freeze. And so, you know, I know the governor is trying to avoid that necessarily occupying the entire conversation around the electrical grid. But as far as funding, I mean, I work a lot with the EDA side. And so I touch a lot of water projects and the transportation and mobility. But I would say, for instance, our rural areas, Texas Department of Agriculture has been really smart and supporting a lot of more innovative things, particularly that fund the planning, because a big part of these decision-making processes is just like deciding not just what projects need to be done, but all of the costs associated with doing a full, whether it's a feasibility analysis or paying the engineers to actually size up what that investment needs to be. They have been a good resource, but they're actually reformatting some of that right now. In the past, they had a pretty open, not necessarily non-competitive, but if you met certain criteria, you could get funding for capital investments that may include resilient infrastructure. But, you know, that program has been sort of, I'm hoping that they at least release some information by later this summer. But for instance, hurricane season is upon us in less than 100 days. Right around the freeze, we hit that 100-day countdown to hurricane season. So I would say we have some resources, but I'd say as a state, we don't have a strong set of earmarks specifically for resilient infrastructure. You kind of make do with knowing the different departments.
Well, thank you, Jillian, again, so much. I really appreciate your presentation and the thoughtfulness, and appreciate all the questions that have come from our attendees. So I am going to now present Mr. McGlynn. Let me, where is it? Put in waiting room, start video, and then spotlight. And stop video. Hold on. Having some technical difficulties here. There we go. So I'm happy to introduce Sean McGlynn, who is the Santa Rosa City Manager, has been there since 2014. He was previously a Deputy City Manager with the City of El Paso, Texas, overseeing a range of departments, including aviation, planning, and economic development. Last year, Mr. McGlynn was named City Manager of the Year by the California City Management Foundation for going beyond the call of duty to lead and serve the community. And we're really fortunate to have Sean here today to talk about the Tubbs fire, where it started, how it impacted their community, and lessons learned, and how they're moving into the new fire season.
So thank you, Cheryl. I would like to begin with a little bit of a video presentation. So if I don't know if I have the screen share capability
Yep.
on.
Yep, you're up there.
Okay, so let me see if this works. Tell me if you see it or not. Are you
see
seeing it?
Yeah.
Okay. So let me pull up the actual presentation, and give me a second. That's always a bit emotional for the city manager to sit through. So Santa Rosa, for those of you who don't know, is the county seat in of the county of Sonoma. We're about 200,000 folks. We hadn't really faced a major disaster since 1963. Eerily enough, that disaster followed a very similar footprint to the one we encountered back in October of 2017. We're a city that sits 30% in the wildland urban interface. So that's a fairly sizable portion of our city, but that wasn't the only portion of our city hit. As you can see on the left side of the screen, we're bisected by 101. This fire actually jumped 6 lanes of freeway to move out of the wildland urban interface into the heart of our community. And you can see in the video the devastation, the lunar landscape that fire left in its path. But I want to provide that as context because where Jillian was talking about the challenges in her particular area, What you're going to find with us is we're highly zoned community. We're a community that has an urban growth boundary. So we don't do some of the things that other places do, which is annex on its fringes and compound the issue of how we impact our community. We're an infill development community. So we were doing the things going into 17 that we were told to do to create a safer community and provide a safer environment for our citizens. And those communities that are in the red in the urban wildland interface were award-winning fire-wise communities going into the 17 environment. Meant they took care of their issues. So this is just a synopsis of what happened that night. It traveled. We've had the joy and the pleasure of sharing these events with our colleagues from other counties. None of these fires that I'm going to be talking about, or the Tubbs fires, started in the city of Santa Rosa. They came to us. And the one I want to point to you, the most critical part of this, is it traveled 12 nautical miles in only 3 hours overnight. That is incredible. The 1963 fire, the Handley fire, did that over several days. And the reason being is climate change, the environment we sit in, and a prolonged drought that had really weakened the tree's ability to resist this. But when the embers came, they came fast and they came furious. This was the total damages of the Tubbs, and within the city limits, we lost 9 of our residents. We had over 3,000 buildings destroyed, and you can see predominantly those were residential structures. And I want to point to another number in this, is we lost 5% of our housing stock. As many of you know, we struggle with housing in coastal California, and 5% of our housing stock also represented our vacancy rate at the time. So essentially, you could argue we actually had no place to put anybody. And you want to talking about where that economically leaves you, it socially leaves you. That was a huge issue for us. We lost our entire vacancy rate in one evening. So this lays out what happened that night. It wasn't just one fire. It was actually a complex of fires that happened over a period of time. And even though the major damage to the city happened between October 8th and 9th, we were still wrestling with regional fire risk through October 14th, when we had spot fires in the community of Oakmont, another one of our wildland and urban interface communities. Again, just shows you that complex and the geographical hit, which meant resources to combat that fireworks stretched incredibly thin. We can't thank the state. We can't thank our colleagues in other states. Oregon and Nevada helped us during that period of time. So we really appreciate the assistance, because we would not have been able to get through this event without our colleagues, both on the state and federal level and other states. So, but events before COVID, emergency events happen pretty quickly. Even if they trail on for a little bit, you're leaning into recovery really, really fast. One of the things I want to remind everybody is that one of our real challenges was that we had no place to put anybody. We lost, as you saw, 25% of our hotel space. We lost 5% of our housing stock. Housing was a crisis beforehand. What happens with those particular properties if they are prolonged in their rebuild scenario? How are we going to get labor to actually rebuild those houses? So we were really struggling to figure out how we're going to deal with this. So we had to make an adjustment in our structure and adapt to the event that was in front of us. You can do this in a myriad of ways, but we decided we would be the best custodians of that process, and that we would, because of our labor shortage, because of our housing shortage, we would lean into contract services to help us fill out our structure. And you can see the issue for us, as I illustrated, was the loss of those houses. And it wasn't simply damage to those houses were gone. And those were incredibly difficult circumstances for the trauma for the individuals involved, but they were also, frankly, dangerous sites. We had to spend weeks with EPA making sure that it was safe to allow folks to go back to that debris field that you saw in the video. And we identified early on the real challenge for us was going to be, how do we create an environment that encourages the rebuilding? But you have to think about what it means to have nearly 3,000 individual homeowners lose their home. Most people have not gone through the building process. So essentially we were looking at 3,000, almost 3,000 individual developers. So how is your system going to handle that? Because thankfully the state gave us some latitude on property tax, meaning they would backfill for 2 years, but that is only 2 years. And if property tax is the basis of how you function, how you support yourselves and your essential revenue, you have to figure out how you're going to get that back. You have to heal the trauma. You have to create opportunity for those 3,000 homeowners to actually be successful as developers. And you have to keep your eyes on the prize that you're going to maybe get some initial help, initial assistance, but those economic equations that are going to impact you are coming really, really quickly down the pipe. So I will tell you, we were leaning into recovery within the first 24 hours of the fire disaster. You cannot wait. You have to start to identify what your essential question is, what you're trying to solve, and how you're going to go about solving those challenges. We got tremendous amount of support from our elected leadership during that period of time. You can read some of this here, but the one I want to really focus on is the Resilient City Permit Center that we stood up. The staff was incredible. They brought this idea forward that what we needed to do, because one of the things we knew about our community was that actually we had a fairly hefty percentage of insurance coverage. So we were a really well insured community, but that's the kind of data you need to have ahead of this kind of conversation, ahead of disaster. The more data, the more you know about your community, the more flexibility you'll have when you're addressing an emergency. What do we also know about insured folks is that they're going to actually get their fees covered for permit submission as part of their insurance package. That allowed us with confidence to stand up an idea where we would take some of our meager reserves, which had been drained from about $25 million down to $10 million. We took an additional $5 million in reserves and invested it in a contract with a third party to expand our permitting center to specialize on those 3,000 individuals who are now going to be in the process of rebuilding their home. So we set up a discrete center with discrete timetables. Again, you don't have housing stock. You don't necessarily have available labor to address this. The quickest way was to enter into a partnership with a private sector firm that we would set the goals and parameters around, and our staff would supervise, but they would stand up the facility. I will tell you, we were banking on those permit fees, and there was some tight moments in the first 2 months of that process where not a single permit fee was pulled. But that permit center served another function. It served the educational and trauma relief. You're talking about people who don't know where to start. All they wanted to do was come in and talk to us, talk to somebody about, how do I rebuild my home? I've never been in this place before. And it was emotional. And that staff served in that emotional trauma support capacity for those individual homeowners. But it took the risk of staff, it took the risk of council to invest in this relationship. And we've been able to recoup those funds. And over 3 years later, we're held up as one of the success stories in this kind of recovery. We have 80% of those folks in the process of rebuild, and nearly 70% have certificates of occupancy. So I don't know what a better success story is. 3 years out, we're no longer getting supported backfill from the state, but we have not seen property devaluation in this process. So again, we met weekly, we gave regular communications to our community, and we dashboarded what recovery was like. We were working with some folks who advised us not to do this because they said this changes all the time. But it was critical for us to provide transparency for our community, get them to understand that this process is not an easy process. And even when we're working with the best of intention with our federal and state partners, dynamics change. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. But the one that was causing most folks the most heartburn was the FEMA Public Assistance Project dashboard. Because if you go through a process, you understand your preliminary assessments may not be your final assessments. But we were committed to making this as transparent and bring the community along with us through the entire recovery process. And this is just a snapshot of what we were able to do. This isn't current numbers. I just want to show you what you could look at. You could look at where people were in the permitting process, what was in construction, how many are complete, and this still exists on our website today. We're committed as an organization, as a community, to get people back in their homes. It also helped us deal with issues that arose during the circumstances. So you all know, during a disaster, it's not just what you discover on day one, you may discover things 30 days out. So this is a map of what we discovered during the course of our investigation nearly a month later. Our initial damage assessment looked at surface damage because that's what we could see. And in fact, that's what FEMA goes on, is what's the visible damage. Underground in part of our community, the heat that you saw in that video was so intense that plastic pipe melted underground. That pipe, that melted or material penetrated the water system and caused us to have contamination in part of our community. So what we needed to communicate to the rest of the community was your water's okay, but we also had to communicate to this part of the community what the status of their water was, because you can't rebuild until this infrastructure is fixed. And here's the kicker in this conversation. FEMA only looks at visible damage. So we had to spend nearly 6 months in our process proving to FEMA that this damage underground in the water system was caused by the fire. At the same time, we're coming up with plans about how quickly we can remedy this situation, maximize our reimbursement from our federal partners, and ensure that those folks aren't delayed in their rebuilding process. And because this is the elevated, wooey part of our community, we knew this was going to be a more difficult rebuild for that part. But it's also the highest property tax valuation part of our community. So really important that we sustain that revenue for the long term. Again, I can't emphasize enough, record keeping, making sure that you're prepared on your record keeping. And just like the water, make sure you have before and after pictures of your infrastructure to demonstrate to your partners that that damage that you see, that damage that you experience, is part of your disaster and your recovery process. And then how do we welcome people back to their home? Because remember, it's still a complicated process. People have usually gotten their certificate of occupancy. They don't understand that you can't occupy your house before you get that certificate of occupancy, or you might jeopardize your insurance reimbursement. So educating them, because often they bought into that plan community. So it wasn't just up front, it was final phases. And once we get you in your house, how can we ensure that the assets around you, the street lights, the street poles, the community park, are brought online as quickly as possible in that recovery process? And then I can't emphasize enough, you're going to see our story a little bit, but when you're doing this, you need to think about your own employees. Over 50 of our employees in the Tubbs Fire lost their homes. They were directly traumatized, but we're a close-knit community that supports each other. And so we may have had friends, we may have had folks that are extended family that were impacted by this event. And it is also difficult to go through some of those neighborhoods and want to help and be in the challenging circumstances of waiting for other processes to unfold. So again, recognizing your employees, supporting your employees. In fact, beyond this particular recognition, we actually made a documentary about what our employees went through in that particular night. It's called Last October. If it's a really powerful film about what our employees did, the situations they faced, and how everybody pitched in to help that community that night. And you can find it, and I'll make sure Cheryl has a copy of the link so that you can view it. But again, that's not, we had to recognize that that wasn't a singular event. This is the last 3 years of fires in our region. This is going to be an ongoing issue, and that we have to not just deal with the recovery of 17, how do we become more resilient in the community and protect not just our life, but our economy in that period of time? Because we enter a high risk season from late August through early November. And we depend on tourism dollars in our county. We need to make sure that people feel safe, not just our community, but our visitors. I will show you this because it does illustrate, I think, where we've been able to go. Even in the most stretched, challenging set of circumstances, the biggest number we recognize is that since 17, while we've been hit by these fires, there have been no fatalities in those fires. And additionally, you can see the city has been able to weather that in a way that we weren't able to weather those events in the past. So what were those catalytic improvements that have allowed us to move from where we were in 17 to where we are today? Early detection is critical, right? I told you it took 3 hours, but even there, if we'd been able to detect that system earlier, we would have been able to respond in a more aggressive manner. Our improvement in our alert and warning systems, that key component that Jillian was stressing around cooperation, collaboration on the state level, on the local level, that's going to be the key to having a resilient program to response. Our own operational enhancements and our community engagement. One of the issues that we had to really honestly have a conversation with the community is we do not have enough, nor does any community have enough public safety first responders to rely on them. We rely on the community. And that was one of the great news stories in 17 is the door knocking that went on, the assistance that took place within the community to help people get out and evacuate. We need you to be an active participant in our own safety and resiliency. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but it's the scattering of the cameras that have infrared ability, and so at night we can actually see the fire. That's a collaboration with the water agents, the Sonoma County Water Agency, multi-county jurisdictions. We have cameras of our own, but it gives us a fidelity and insight that we've never had before in the region. And that came through that cooperative just investment and giving each other access to that equipment, but also with our federal partners who invested in us and made us have those resources available to do this work. Alert and warning, reorganization of the tools, and we've advocated on how we could get access to IPAWS, the WIA system. We didn't have access to that prior to the 17 disaster. We now have that. We work with high-low sirens in our police cars, and you won't know how that has been so successful. We've adopted that European model. There's a sound we only use during evacuations, and we've educated our community that when you hear that sound, that means to get out of that area. We've worked hard, as you saw from Jillian, just like Jillian, on what those evacuation zones were like. And when we had our fire last year that penetrated our Oakmont community and part of Skyhawk community in the WUI, those folks were out and safe well before the fire risk hit those areas. And again, it's about that collaboration. The cities now meet regularly, and it prepared us to go into this new COVID model of cooperation, where we as cities are working jointly, not making moves ahead of each other, coordinated in our response. And the fire departments have done the same work. We have, talk about fragmentation, in a county of about 600,000 souls, we have over 35 fire districts. So that coordination, collaboration is essential for success. And we work with our MPOs, and just like Jillian says, we rely on our educational institutions to help us think through and problem solve. We now have a scenario generator that we've shared with different educational institutions and the students at those educational institutions to help us think. And by doing so, we're preparing our next generation of leadership in our community and awareness in our community. So we also have done operational enhancements. We now stand up on all call whenever there's a red flag warning. That helps us communicate that we are a safe community. You're going to know if you come visit us, you can be assured that we're going to be safety first in every action we take. And part of that has been assistance that's been provided by the state of California, which has now provided communities pre-positioning dollars, because this is not cheap to stand up this type of resource on an on-call basis. And it can be questioned if the event doesn't materialize. And we've had several events that haven't materialized, but our community is so grateful that we have the ability now to stand up that resource and lessen the anxiety when we go through our high-risk seasons. We've also adopted a community wildfire protection plan, which has a range of approaches, including, for the first time, where we've approved a community pile burning ordinance, which you have to pull a permit. It's restricted to certain acreages in certain areas of the city, but to help us additionally address vegetation management and dead and dying trees, which have been really severely hit by the drought. This will give us another tool where it would have been impossible before, and certainly not cost effective, to remove that vegetation from some of our open space and woodland areas within the city limits. And so I'll wrap up with that community engagement principle that has been essential for not just us getting to recovery, but building that resiliency, because a resilient community is an educated community, and I can't stress that enough. Infrastructure is great, but there's a limitation to infrastructure. We have to always rely on human capital and making sure that our communities are educated, because they're going to be the first support network we need in a response to a disaster, and they may be the essential person who's helping a neighbor understand the risk that is coming towards them. We really do emphasize neighbors need to help neighbors. Neighbors need to understand their community, need to get educated, understand evacuation routes, and help those that are most vulnerable in our communities respond to those set of circumstances. And with that, I'm happy to entertain any questions.
Thank you. We have a few. Let's start with, you were doing everything right. You had the infill, you had some, you had the good clearing, the 30 feet, and yet it didn't work. What did you do, anything in response to, you thought you were doing things right, but you didn't measure up? What did you do to answer that question?
So I think one of the great things is that we've gotten to that partnership space with the community. So you saw we've changed evacuation routes. We've adopted a wood pile burning ordinance. We have a community wildfire protection plan, which is going to give us some more incentive and some more teeth to deal with issues in the community that be prolonged. But to be honest, where the real work has happened is on the regional level, because none of those fires started in the city of Santa Rosa. They came from Napa County through Embercast, and very, very quickly. So we've worked to build those regional communication networks and to make sure that we can deploy resources to support those. If you stop this at the border of your community, you're not going to have success in mitigating the threat.
You created the Resilient City Permit Center. Were there anything other efforts that maybe addressed the business community, and perhaps how did you recover, on the economic side of things? You talked about the permit fees and the property taxes. What else was out there for you?
So again, understanding the essential question, we developed a working group with our partners in the development community to really help them streamline that process so that they could, and that became what we adopted into measures of the Resilient City. We waived new noise ordinances during certain periods of time because those things could interfere with construction schedules. And we tried to create different opportunities through that process to support the business community. But really, you have to identify the essential question: where is the opportunity? And the opportunity was in construction. So we needed to really work closely with our partners in the construction industry to make sure they were getting their needs met. We did have some concerns about other revenue streams, but while tourism is important to us, it's not an overriding concern for us. But we also started to ask those developers and those private sector entities in the hotel business what we could do to accelerate their return. And we've just opened a couple of hotels in response to that. But for us, the focus was on how do we support the construction community. And one of the things we offered the construction community was the ability to house people in trailers on properties while they were doing the construction, which is not normally what you would find in a residential zone or permission. We were trying to be that cooperative with those partners, and we started meeting with them early on.
What kind of state resources or even federal resources did you tap into to help with recovery and resiliency?
Well, so when you look at those pictures, the thing that I think is pretty easy to figure out is until you clear the debris, you cannot move forward any program on rebuilding. So debris clearance is critical. What we were able to identify early on is that as a community of our size, with the tonnage of debris, the complexity of that debris and the hazards associated with that debris, we didn't have the resources, both financially or staff-wise, to be able to manage a program like that. So we immediately turned to our state to assist us. And the state, looking at the material, turned to the federal government. And the federal government deployed the Army Corps of Engineers. And I will say, there was pain with that, but in its ultimate assignment, getting those spaces cleared was so critical to recovery, and at the same time protected our watersheds. So we got essentially through debris clearance in 9 months in all of those neighborhoods.
Wow. It appears that you couldn't prevent the fire hitting you, but have you changed any of your zoning or the way you construct your housing in your business areas? Have you done anything differently with your land use planning?
Well, we are, and we have. I mean, one of the things that you can't escape is that you have to be updated to current code, right? And so one of the things that has changed is all those rebuild neighborhoods have to be up to the most current fire resiliency measures. You can't go backwards. It's not an option we can waive. So one thing I can say is all those communities are now improved in that space. We are, as I said before, adopting different ordinances to improve construction in those areas. But some of it is we have to get partners in those areas. We have areas that were not built for this repeated fire in terms of evacuation. So we've worked with those community groups to provide access to certain areas that where emergency response vehicles are only utilized. But we have to get that. That's one of our big requests of the state and federal government right now. We're actually advocating on that, is how we can get more control of our infrastructure to respond to the current set of circumstances. So we're working on the policy side, we're working on the infrastructure side. It's a continuous process for us to improve and ensure that we're the safest community we can be.
One more. Any lessons from this fire response to COVID-19 response?
So I will say, having repeatedly go through this environment, it left us better prepared because we were practiced. And so I cannot emphasize enough that you are going to be better prepared if you've practiced and you've made some decisions about how things are going to work ahead of time. So we have a structure to our response and our emergencies that has allowed us a level of fluidity and a level of understanding that we didn't before. So one of our biggest threats is early on in the COVID environment was our homeless shelter. And even before we're a city that runs a homeless shelter. We're the landlord. We work with Catholic Charities. But what did we know early on is that that was an incredibly vulnerable site because it's congregate living to potential the spread of the virus. We also understood, because we were prepared, that we could rely on that being response to an event through FEMA reimbursement. At the time, it was only 75%, but we started to rent hotel rooms in our community to provide those folks that were most vulnerable in the shelter a space to isolate, knowing that we're going to get reimbursement, but also knowing that investment was going to pay dividend for hotels that were now vacant because of the shelter-in-place order from the state government. So it served two functions. It helped our economy keep going, and it helped address a safety need within our community. But that came out of being prepared for that event. And I know some other communities haven't really put all those pieces together yet. That's why you've got to practice. You've got to figure out how to make decisions ahead of time. And the more plans you have in place to address this and a structure you have in place to work in an emergency environment, the better off you're going to be.
Okay, is that all the questions for now, Don?
Yes, it is.
We're kind of out of time with questions. Well, thank you, Sean, so much.
Thank you.
I think it's important for our attendees to understand that part of our efforts with this program and planning is our plan will include resiliency measures because there will be economic shocks in the future. And so we hope to learn from others who have experienced these devastating events so that we can weave in resiliency activities in an effort to soften any kind of economic shock in the future. And Sean, it's just been a pleasure working with you. And I'm sure if there's other questions for any of our presenters after this presentation is over, please feel free to send them on over and we'll get them to Sean, Jillian, and Mark. Which brings us to, so I'm going to ask you to stop sharing, Sean. And now I'm going to look for Mark. And, oop. There's, let's see.
Can you see me?
Not yet, I'm trying to get rid of Sean. Hold on. Sorry, Sean.
It's good.
Okay. Hold on. So, Mark. Where are you, Mark?
I can see it, Cheryl. Screen's up.
I know, but Mark isn't.
I see him.
Oh, you do?
Yeah, he's the upper right, and he's on screen share already. So
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I still have Sean on. Here we go. Okay, can everybody see Mark? I hope. We've got everybody on mute. Okay, so you are viewing Mark's screen. View options. Side by side mode.
You're okay. You're okay.
There you go.
You're okay. Just take them off mute.
Okay, and Mark, you can go ahead and go now. Yeah, there you go. So I'd like to introduce to you all Mark Schoenberg. He's a U.S. Army Colonel retired. He is president of TerraScale, a clean infrastructure design and a development firm that is bringing Project Energos, a 3,700-acre mixed-use development near Fernley, Nevada, Reno, Nevada, that aims to enable secure, swift storage and transmission of data between government agencies and commercial clients. Mr. Schoenberg has more than 3 decades of senior leadership in the United States military in IT services, cybersecurity, and data center construction. We're really happy to have you today and get us all informed on what we need to do to create resiliency for our communities with cybersecurity.
All right, well, thank you, Cheryl. So I am going to do the same thing Julian did. I'm going to stop my video while I brief. I'm out here in Los Angeles, only the 2nd largest city in the country with really bad internet service. So let me stop this. But I'm well aware that it's me between the end of this, the end of the program, and I want to save some time for questions. So with that, let me go ahead and move on. Hopefully I can get this to, there we go. So real quick, these are kind of the topics I'm going to cover. Cyber resiliency is different from what, was obviously briefed by Sean and Julian. You can't touch it. It's hard to quantify from an economic perspective. It's just different. It doesn't immediately affect people's lives like losing their house, but it is still there, and it can really affect your local businesses. And it's something that your current IT staff can't help you with. They'll say that they can, but they can't. And so that I'll move along. So again, as Cheryl said, I've got about 30 years in IT and cyber management. When the whole cyber thing stood up, as you would expect, we in the military got on board as a threat to our command and control systems. The last thing I did was I was running all the cyber defensive operations and cybersecurity operations for U.S. Africa Command. And now I'm the president of TerraScale, and in a weird twist of fate, one of the things we focus on is resiliency based on green power and green technology. So that's kind of how my career has flowed. I've listened to a few references up front for everyone. These are some of the articles I referred to and some of the sites I referred to. These are good places to go to take a moment and think, because when you deal with stuff that you can't see, you need to think, and it takes a bit, especially if you're a sensor, especially if you're a person who likes to process stuff by touching it. Cyber can be very challenging. All right, so one of the things that I always have issues with when I'm dealing with groups is how do you define what cyber resiliency is, and what is the difference between resiliency and security and all those kind of what I would say conflicting terms. The bottom line here, and the easiest thing, obviously being resilient allows you to recover from adverse conditions. But the simple layman's term is, how well can you take a punch, and are you still standing? And how quickly can you get back to what normal is? Just like the communities we were talking about earlier with the fire and the flood, the idea is to get back to normal as fast as you can. But again, cyber resiliency is somewhat different because it can be affected by a bad actor. There's several countries that could potentially sponsor state cyber activity that could be malicious to you, but it could also be affected from a natural disaster. So you could have a situation where all your your resiliency from an IT perspective goes away because you have no power. And so it encompasses a lot of things beyond what is typically straightforward. I mean, obviously fires and floods are very damaging and very direct impacts on people's lives, but there's a clear path to recovery. We've done this. You've seen this before. History has shown you, as Sean laid out, they learned from 2017, 2018, 2019, where in this case, it's not naturally caused. It's not naturally reoccurring. You could get hit with a cyber situation today. You could get it all fixed, and the next month you could get hit with a different one. So it is a challenge from that aspect. All right, this is a little bit of just the threat is real, and I separated this into some stuff that I thought that would help lay it out. Nothing is sacred when it comes to this. As you can see, they've attacked the COVID-19 supply chain. They've attacked the logistical management software used to move around, in many cases, the COVID-19 vaccine, but also things like FedEx, UPS. Nothing sacred. You can see over in the banking, it's hard to lay out the economic impact many times from a cyber attack or a cyber incident. You can see over here, these are straightforward examples of just pure extortion and crime. But if you're the New Zealand Central Bank and you're getting breached, what does that do to the customers that bank there? What does that do with the government, the state, the city, the county, responsible for ensuring that those business standards, you can change the code for something like a dike to hold back water. How do you change the code to something that you really can't touch? And how do you enforce it, right? All very challenging and hard problems. Then perhaps the stuff that's really, really gets you worried is stuff like the recent attack that we had in Florida, where a cyber threat actor came in and tried to raise the sodium hydroxide level in the water. I mean, this is something that could affect an entire community immediately, and why it's typically part of the water purification process. If you put sodium hydroxide at large levels into your water supply, your hospitals are going to be overwhelmed because it's going to cause internal damage. It might actually kill some people that have pre-existing medical conditions. So the trickle-down effect is almost immediate, and it can be overwhelming. And then last but not least, I threw this in there because you've all heard of the SolarWinds hack. It's gotten a lot of press here recently. That was really typically a hack. That got all the press, but the reality is for most small businesses, unless you were dealing with intellectual property that got stolen, that was not that big of a deal. It just got amplified in the news. Unlike the sodium hydroxide, which is a big deal. So again, separating fact from fiction, separating what's a high risk versus a low risk, these are all challenges that aren't very clear to a city manager, a governor, even on the federal level. Lots of confusion. Do you go to the U.S. CERT, which is ran by DHS, the Computer Emergency Response Team, when all the expertise sits over in the DoD, or the vast majority of it, and the Department of Defense is prohibited by law from doing collection actions, which you could potentially do if you're doing a mitigation for a cyber event against U.S. citizens. So very, very complex, lots of different authorities and lots of different government regulation. So I'm just putting this out there just to frame it from terms of the industry. Your average data center operator, if they are down for an hour, costs $260,000 roughly. That's 2018. I will tell you, I have a good friend of mine that ran Uber's data center. They were down for 15 minutes here recently during the pandemic, and they're still calculating for 15 minutes. And their initial estimate is between Uber Eats and the drives and all stuff that they lost $27 million. Now, obviously, Uber is a big company. So it's much easier for them to recover from that. But that doesn't include the second and third order effects of the local economy. So when Uber Eats is down, how much business does the local restaurant lose? How much does the company that's depending on just-in-time logistics to restock their shelves? What about the doctors that want to have the healthcare records that they can't access? And then typically just office functions such as email could be out. And so you could lose a lot of connectivity. And I just throw this out there to try to frame this. If you've been in an office building and the power goes out, take a moment to walk in the hallway and look how lost the workforce is without their IT capabilities. People literally cannot work and cannot function. And so that just shows you how connected we are in today's modern world. I try to think back because I'm old enough to exist before the internet was a big thing. And I try to think back and remember what I did before I had my computer and my cell phone and everything else. And I remember being very, very busy, but I don't know if I could function that way today. And so again, the risk is so large to your business community and even the government community as well. As Sean was talking about all the portal sites and all the information they were sharing, well, the only way that makes that capable is through internet access and computers. All that could be easily denied by a cyber adversary, or if the building that they were housing that cyber or the IT equipment in was one that was affected by the fire. So lots of second and third order effects that don't really hit you right away until you start peeling that onion back. So where do we stand today? This is, most small and medium businesses really can't withstand a cyber incident or cyber attack. As you can see here, 70% of the organizations have no response plan. That's not surprising because you'd have to have the staff and the money and the resources required. And the facts speak for themselves. They're the percentage, 60% of small businesses go out of business if they have an attack, because how do you recover without spending more capital? Extremely challenges. And then again, just more bad news for small businesses if your data breach, shutting down. Many of these incidents involve theft of IP, intellectual property. And so if you're a small business and you're revolved around your good ideas, your intellectual property, and now you've just lost those, that can be irrecoverable. So I said it was expensive, and it is. They're hard to negotiate. Why are they hard to negotiate? Because it's hard to touch. You may spend $20 million on cybersecurity, cyber resiliency, extra equipment, and you may never have to use it. And that's capital that you can't use, right? That's equipment and hardware you buy for the county that you can't use on something else. So it's very hard. It's an easy trade-off, again, because you can't see it. Obviously, many of these numbers are dealt from big companies, and so you have to keep that in scale. But when you're looking at $15.4 billion for the average cost to remediate a data breach, as opposed to what the budget is for putting in resiliency, you can see that it's not a very good trade-off. So if you skimp on your resiliency, the effects can be massive. And from a government perspective, I will tell you, people losing faith in your capability to respond and communicate, that is very difficult to recover from. Again, just some more ideas on framing it. You need leadership buy-in. As many of you know, the reason, having leadership buy-in in your plan and then having a report, what we're really talking about here is ingraining cyber resilience, cybersecurity, and these functions into your business processes. And then who's responsible for that business process? I would argue that resiliency is not the IT department, it's your operations department. And if you're not treating it as an operational issue, that needs to be managed just like you would manage, you know, your ambulance service, your fire, your police. These are operational functions that are executed in the community. You're going to miss it. It's always going to take a back seat. It's not something that sits in the IT department. It's something that should be foremost in the mind of your senior leaders. And again, why is this a problem? Well, it's expensive. And if you haven't had that issue before, you're not inclined to spend a lot of money on that, especially if the trade-off is, you know, something you're going to do to prevent like the fires that Sean talked about before. Those are, you know, many of these decisions are political, but understanding at least what you're trading off and what you're giving up, I think is an important first step. And this kind of goes back to the point where I just said, so what makes most organizations wake up and start investing? Well, getting hit by an incident makes them stand up. As you can see over on the right-hand side of the slide, you know, an attack on your organization motivates you to change. Even a attack on your partner, your competitor, somebody in your supply chain, really is not a driver within the industry. And you can see, you know, only 5% of the companies would be, you know, likely to increase their cyber budgets based on one of their partners being victimized. And many of you probably have already dealt with data breaches in your environments already. Okay, so a few keys to how we're going to lay out this and things that you can do, because this is really about putting this in your planning process system. You know, ask yourself what would be the most dire consequence to your business, your government agency, your nonprofit, what you could survive losing. So not all systems and not all things are created equal. You might be able to lose your Facebook page. You might be able to lose your web page. That might be something that you don't want to put resources on, but your SharePoint site is something that absolutely has to stay up. Or it might be the vice versa. Your Facebook page may be the way you communicate and get information out to the community. And so that may be much more essential to you than, say, your email server. So you have to, it's different for everyone. So you'll have to go through and prioritize the systems that are key to what you want to achieve. And then you have to develop the security plan, and you can't neglect the actual technical side of it. This is a technical, highly technical process. And in order to be able to affect change, it's not going out and clearing brush from a tree line. It's many cases, it's writing code, it's redesigning your hardware architecture and your software architecture. So again, deploying state-of-the-art defenses, that's what you have to do. You have to figure out how to keep up with the enemy, so to speak. And I know that's a term that some people have a problem with, but there are bad actors out there, and you can guarantee, and I guarantee you that they are using cutting edge technology. So if you're not keeping abreast, and if you don't have a mechanism to keep abreast of what's going on, you're going to be behind when it comes to protecting your cyber resources. So the next couple of steps I'd recommend you take a look at is, you know, what's it take to do a successful recovery from an attack? You know, what channels would you go through? So for example, I want to take down the city's Facebook page. Well, who approves that? Is that the mayor? Is that your emergency operations center director? Having those processes in place, you know, are key to being able to respond. I will tell you from my personal experiences, delegating down to the lowest reasonable level is the only way to quickly respond to things like that. And then determine the proper testing and review of the program. So as Sean said earlier, practice makes perfect. Absolutely, you have to involve cyber. Every city, every county goes through emergency response drills. And if you're going through an emergency response drill and you're not including cyber as part of that scenario, you're really doing yourself a disservice. To assume that you're going to have that when you need it. And I think Julian, was talking earlier about radios and some of the processes they had previous not being adequate. To assume that you're going to have it in your training environment gives you a false sense of security. So make sure hey, at the training objective for this part of the exercise is we lose all of our IT capabilities. How are we going to operate? Well, it might be going back to old school things like radios. Again, those need to be built into your rehearsals, because if they're not, you're never going to develop a plan. You're never going to identify where your weaknesses are. And remember, when you're talking about cyber, IT, and these services and the new stuff, your cell phones included, everything is connected. Everything's connected. So you really need to understand those connection points so that you can plan on what to do if something were to occur. How do you do your continuity of operations? Do you have an alternate site in another city, in another county? How do you do, it could be something as simple as remote work. All right, we don't have enough money to do a continuity of operations site, but what we'll do is we'll have people do remote work from their house. How do we enable that so that they can do that when we've lost capability in cyberspace? And a couple of key takeaways for you just to think about: disaster recovery, business durability, and IT continuity of operations. These are all part of cyber resiliency. So it's a little bit more straightforward traditionally. We've lost this building because of flooding, our main EOC, we're going to move to our alternate EOC. You've got to have that kind of capability in cyberspace. It's a bit more difficult, a bit harder to touch, but it could be something as simple as our primary IT infrastructure is going to be at our main EOC. We're going to have 100% redundancy at our alternate EOC. And so those kind of things need to be considered as you go forward. And again, as you frame this, it's all about risk management for the senior leaders in your company, the senior leaders in your city, your county, your state, because this stuff's expensive. Just for an example, my last job in AFRICOM, my IT budget was $120 million a year. And that's probably more than most of the IT budgets is combined in a lot of the organizations on this call. And yet it was a constant fight because of where we were to try to stay ahead on many of the incidents. Something as simple as a power failure could cause significant damage to my resiliency of my network and my cyber capabilities. So it's expensive, and because it's so expensive, you have to really, really focus in on what's critical to your business or your organization. So 3 key takeaways that I want to leave you guys with, and these are really stuff from my experience. So you have to understand your IT architecture. Everything's connected, but if you're not an IT or cyber person, and even some that are, how do you define that risk? Well, you've got to be able to visualize how your network and how your services are connected. So the best way I would advise you to approach this is something as simple as like a community road system. As Sean was developing his evac plan for people in certain areas, he's looking at, is that a dead end road? Is that a road that I can go left or right? What are all my paths to get everybody out of the area? And the same thing happens with your IT infrastructure and your cyber resilient infrastructure. You can lay it out just like that. If you do not have that in your organization, you're never going to be able to assess risk, because you won't be able to understand where those key points are where everything interconnects. For example, your building you're in right now, your state EOC, if it has one connection in from a local fiber provider, service provider, now you have a single point of failure. If you don't lay that out, you're never going to have resiliency in your network. You might have the double systems, everything backed up, and you might get foiled by the fact that you only have one internet connection coming into your site. Or you'll contract out for somebody to provide you redundancy, but that will run through the fiber optic cable will actually run through the same manhole system to get off your site. Those things are really key and critical to identify to understand how resilient you are. And those should be the exact kind of things that you rehearse when you do your crisis events rehearsals. The other thing I would just say is you have to, again, rehearse. If you have the capability of doing this, getting penetration testing from an outside cyber hacking organization is really, really helpful. It allows somebody else to come in and identify your weaknesses. And then what you want them to do as they outbrief you is to give you a priority list on what is the easiest way, what's your most vulnerable avenues that somebody could affect you. And so that you have a way of prioritizing not only your risk, but your monetary funds to address those problems. Because it's easy for me to come in and run a report and give you 60 findings, but not all findings are equal. And so you want to keep the teenager at bay, but yet you're not really worried or equipped to handle the Russians infiltrating your power grid. So these are things that you need to demand of those as you go. And remember, and I say this up front, your IT department is not qualified to do this. They will tell you they are because it's in their nature to make things happen. They'll say, sure, we can do it, but it requires a different skill set. And so you have to keep that in mind. If you nest your cyber resilience and your security programs under your IT department, you are setting yourself up for failure. You may have no choice but to do that given your organizational structure, but at least understand the decision you're making as you go forward. Okay. I want to leave you guys with, there's some references I had up front. There is a cyber resiliency review, which is out there for free of charge from the US government, DHS, the US CERT. It's a good, if you don't understand anything about this environment, there's some good checklists and tools and resources free to you to walk through. Some good scenario development suggestions in there as well for your next training exercise, or as you walk through this to help you fit this into where it would be key to your rehearsal cycle. And with that, I'm open for questions and discussions. Thank you.
Hey,
Yes,
John,
Mark.
do we have questions?
Yes, we do. Mark, can you kind of characterize cybersecurity versus cyber resiliency?
Yeah, so security is almost a protection function. So let's say log on and passwords. That's part of your cybersecurity. Let's say how you physically control access to your IT areas. There's many products out there for cybersecurity. There's endpoint solutions, but that actually sit on your desktop or your laptop that monitor for anomalous activity. But again, it's a traditional security function, which is predicated on access and authorization. That's security. Now, obviously, that's part of being resilient, right? You need to have those security mechanisms. But the resiliency talks about being able to recover. I mean, cyber is, I have this joke, cyber is all things to all people. But really what we're talking about is your IT systems and your business systems when you talk about resiliency. Now, those are enabled, obviously, the better your security are, the less likely you are to have one of those issues. But when you talk about resiliency, you're talking about your ability to bounce back from an event, whether natural or man-made, as opposed to security, which is designed to protect what you have already in place.
This all sounds very expensive. When will we get to affordability, Mark?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. It is very expensive. But what I would say to you is, and let's go back to defining your architecture and what that looks like. How do you even make a decision on what you want to pay for if you don't understand where your risk is? So are you going to solve everything? Absolutely not. Are you going to be able to guarantee that you're 100% defended? Absolutely not. I mean, the SolarWinds thing is a great example. I guarantee you nobody's looking at their networks harder than the U.S. Department of Defense. SolarWinds hit the U.S. Department of Defense. And so it is very expensive, and it's a struggle on how you maintain that against different requirements.
We lost Mark.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. What I would recommend you guys do is you go back to your county, your city, your state organizations, and you see how they can address this. Because for small and medium businesses, and for even city and county organizations, you're going to need help. You're going to need help to figure out, you're going to need help to figure out how you can, you know, address these things in a manner that's economically feasible for where you sit. But yes, it is very expensive.
Last one. Did you and your groups learn anything during the pandemic? Did the pandemic reveal anything that you didn't anticipate?
Well, absolutely. So the remote work part. So now, you know, if I go into my office every day and I'm this is mostly from a security aspect, but it applies to many things. I go in, I sit down on my computer in my office, I log on, that IP is physically assigned to that computer. It's physically inside my building, my cyber perimeter, and I know who you are. Obviously, if there's somebody that goes inside my building, that's a bad actor. That I can't control that. But it's a very controlled environment when you walk into your office building. Now, I have to enable remote work. Well, now now it's a trade-off, right? Now, if we go back to the security and the resilience. So is it more important for me to open all these avenues of access to the information and systems I have to allow you to do the work remotely? Or am I opening myself up to a point where I'm accepting risk because now anybody can get into my system? And so things like Zoom, this is a great example. How many people were working on Zoom to this level before the pandemic? How critical is Zoom or a Zoom-like capability to your organization's ability to do work? And if they were able to affect this and shut this down, whether that was a competitor, an adversary, or just a natural event, what does that mean to you as far as restoring that capability? So again, the pandemic hasn't necessarily increased the risk. What it's done is it's changed the way the risk applies to your organization, because now you have to telework. And for every door you leave open to telework, you potentially leave a door open for somebody to get in there and do malicious and bad things.
Great. Thank you so much, Mark. And thank you, Jillian Donato.